Trump, Surviving at the Top, Chapter 11, Iron Mike and Me. I love sports, but I hated being a team owner. The New Jersey Generals, with Herschel Walker, Doug Flutie, and Brian Sipe, were definitely a class act of the short-lived United States Football League. Still, watching them from the owner's box every week was just too much of a roller coaster ride. When they won, I felt great. When they lost, however, my emotions took a dive, and I walked around feeling lousy until the following Sunday. I hate losing, but when I have no direct control over whether I'm winning or getting beat, I find the situation intolerable. Boxing is different. Boxing, for one thing, is not always a clubby network like the National Football League. In many ways, it's a very simple, very raw business. If you've got the money to lay out for a big match, you can get involved on the highest levels almost instantly. These days, of course, that's a pretty big if. The so-called site fees for major fights have escalated to the point of being almost ridiculous. Even a less than earth-shaking bout can cost $10 million or more, which leads me to the second thing I like about boxing. It allows me to exercise my business instincts. There's no national governing body, no league, virtually no structure of any kind. I'm the one who decides which match to go after and which to pass on, how to deal with the various promoters, and how to manage and market the event so I come out ahead. Staging a big boxing match is like rowing down the road in a very hot sport car, steering and shifting as you negotiate the curves. It's downright nerve-wracking at times, but ultimately, it's great fun. What I don't like about boxing is that it is a business in which there are very few bargains. These days, it's almost impossible not to overpay, at least somewhat, for a major fight. That's because boxing is no longer a business that has to make sense at the box office. Today, the big matches all wind up at casino hotels, usually either at Trump Plaza or the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, or someplace like Las Vegas. Casino hotels can afford to merely break even, or even to lose a little money on ticket sales, because a major boxing match often brings in a huge army of gamblers who line the tables 6 deep and don't go home until they've won or lost a great deal of money. Notice I said that the gamblers often show up. I didn't say always. Sometimes a casino owner will overestimate the appeal of a particular fight and end up losing millions of dollars. The Mike Tyson-Frank Bruno fight of a few years ago is a case in point. Another hotel bought that fight for a reported $5 million, and in one sense, I can't blame them for thinking it was worth a lot. Tyson-Bruno came just a few months after the successful matchup between Tyson and Michael Spinks, about staged, by the way, at the Trump Plaza in Atlantic City. Although it was not exactly a masterpiece of athletic competition, the Tyson-Spinks bout was one of the great events of the 80s. What else, inside or out, the world of sports, make the covers of Life, Time, and People, and Sports Illustrated, and got extensive coverage on primetime network TV. Coming on the heels of that huge success, Tyson-Bruno looked to a lot of people like a can't-miss event. I, however, passed on the bout, feeling that after watching Mike knock out Spinks in 91 seconds, the public just wasn't in the mood for another one-sided spectacle. That was an educated guess, based on no scientific marketing surveys, but as it turned out, I was right. According to the newspaper reports, it was necessary to give away thousands of dollars worth of tickets so their arena would look filled up on TV. I wouldn't be involved in boxing if I didn't believe I have good gut instincts for the sport. It's just too risky a business otherwise. But in boxing, as in any other field, you don't develop instincts without doing a lot of homework. I read the sports pages every day and keep tabs on how certain fights did on pay-per-view and network TV. I also keep in touch with a lot of streetwise people, the kind you don't find on Wall Street, Fifth Avenue, or, for that matter, anywhere outside the strange world of professional boxing. The most interesting boxer of all, in my opinion, is a former Brooklyn street kid named Mike Tyson, the once, and I believe future champion of the world. Mike had a run of fame such as no one else, except perhaps the great Muhammad Ali, has ever had. For a brief but shining period, he looked absolutely superhuman. He was more than just a great boxer. He was one of the most talked about people in the world. I can still remember standing in the great ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York about a month or two before the Buster Douglas fight and watching Mike make an elaborate entrance with his promoter, Don King. The occasion was a dinner to benefit the March of Dimes. Ivana had been responsible for putting together the guest list, and at one point, she had mentioned to me that although the evening included all the big names from the New York social scene and a host of other celebrities, it lacked some special excitement, something that would set it apart from similar events. I can still remember standing in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York about a month or two before the Buster Douglas fight and watching Mike make an elaborate entrance with his promoter, Don King. The occasion was a dinner to benefit the March of Dimes. Ivana had been responsible for putting together the guest list, and at one point she had mentioned to me that although the evening included all the big names from the New York social scene and a host of other celebrities, it lacked some special excitement, something that would set it apart from similar events. I suggested she invite Mike Tyson. One phone call from her was all it took to get the heavyweight champ and Don King to come in from Cleveland. Both said they were happy to help raise money for the March of Dimes and its battle against birth defects. When they entered, Mike and Don caused a stampede among the hundreds of reporters and photographers who had turned out to cover the event. But Mike did more than just show up for the dinner. He also agreed to serve as a celebrity chef and even won an award for his cooking skills from a panel of food critics that included Brian Miller of the New York Times, Craig Claiborne, and Gail Green. The next day, there were pictures in the paper of Mike dressed in a tuxedo and flipping flapjacks. But images like that never linger very long in people's minds. The public, and often the press, preferred to think of Mike as half man, half beast, a fighting machine. That was an image created partly by Mike himself, but mostly by the writers who published scathing articles and books about the young fighter. In many cases, these reporters and authors made a good living off of Mike before they turned on him to make a few more bucks with their pathetic and exaggerated accounts. One such writer is Jose Torres, the former boxer and New York State Athletic Commissioner. Torres befriended Mike and worked with him. And to Mike's face, he couldn't have been nicer. It turned out, though, that Torres used his taped conversations with Mike in a book that was an embarrassment for all concerned. I know Mike Tyson well. In the period since my last book, I've staged his fights against Tyrell Biggs, Larry Holmes, Michael Spinks, and Carl the Truth Williams. And I was also ringside when he lost his title to Buster Douglas in Japan. I've also sat with the champ for many hours in offices, on airplanes, and at ringside at other people's fights. The Mike Tyson I know is a very different guy from the person I've seen portrayed in the press. He's a professional warrior, yes, but he's no semi-human being who was born to fight. Of course, Mike usually goes out of his way not to show his vulnerable side. He grew up on the mean streets, where any sign of weakness could be fatal. He has also been trained since the age of 13, when Cuz D'Amato got a hold of him and first started teaching him how to box. Never let the other guy know you're hurting, and to turn your self-doubt into desire. Mike actually has a great attitude about fear when he learned from Cus, a very wise man in addition to being a legendary fight trainer. Fear is like fire, the old man used to say. If you don't know how to handle it, it can kill you. But if you use it correctly, it can warm your house. That happens to be true in the business world as it is in boxing. What a lot of people have never understood about Mike is that he considers boxing to be a 24-hour-a-day job. Like a comedian who can't stop telling jokes, he is always on, and at least in terms of the impression he wants to give, always ready to rumble. For most of his life, there's always been another fight looming in Mike's future, and that means there are always opponents out there thinking about Mike Tyson and listening to every word he says. Mike understands that, and without sitting down and actually mapping out a strategy, he developed a way to use the press to gain a psychological edge over these prospective rivals. Sometimes he did this with humor. In the dressing room, after some of his early fights, Mike would say things like, "When I hit him, he screamed like a woman," or "I just want to push his nose bone back into his brain." Mike knew those were ridiculous things to say, but he was hoping that the reporters would print out his outrageous remarks and that his next opponent would read them and become a beaten man right then and there. In some instances, it was a pure put on of the press, though that often backfired. The sports writers and TV reporters never realized that Mike, a bit bored with the same old questions, was actually doing a parody of a post-fight interview. They would use his responses, but as examples of what a tough warrior he was. I got a kick out of watching him, because cultivating a killer image is not unknown to dealmakers. A smart man or woman knows that if the other party thinks you're invincible, he may not even bother asking for certain things. Good businessmen and seasoned boxers should both take such tough talk in stride. And yet for a while, Mike got tremendous results with that gambit every time. For example, I don't think I've ever seen a guy as psyched out before a fight as Michael Spinks was as he prepared to fight Tyson. The minute and a half that Spinks spent in the ring with Iron Mike was a mere technicality. Despite being an intelligent guy, or maybe because he had so much good sense, Spinks got dismantled mentally, even before he stepped into the ring. For some reason, though, Buster Douglas was never scared of Mike, and it showed. Maybe it was because Douglas was preoccupied with thoughts of his mother, who had died about a month before he faced Tyson, or perhaps Buster was thinking about his young child's mother, who had just been diagnosed as having a rare and possibly fatal kidney disease, or because Buster is just a lot braver than anyone gives him credit for being. Whatever the reason, he'd fought from the opening bell as if he'd never heard the rumor that Tyson was the greatest of all time. And as much as I like Mike, and though I have a business interest in his future fights at my hotel casinos, I have to say that Douglas fought a truly beautiful fight. The kind that brings to mind the term sweet science. He didn't brawl. He didn't lose his cool and start throwing those big but ineffective roundhouse punches. Rather, he continually set things up with his crisp left jab and followed through with his stinging right. Until then, all of Mike's opponents had been worried about getting hurt. Douglas was the first guy who realized that the best defense was a sensational, non-stop offense. Very few people, including Mike himself, could accept the fact that Tyson simply got beat. Around where I was sitting, people started yelling, "It was fixed! He was drugged!" Later, there was a brief controversy over whether Tyson had been victimized by a long count. But in the end, everyone realized that however many seconds had elapsed, the larger truth was that Mike Tyson just wasn't the better boxer that Mike Tyson just wasn't the better boxer that Sunday afternoon in Japan. I am anxious about what happens next for Mike. No matter whom he fights in the years ahead, he faces his greatest challenge. Now, in a world that asked, "What have you done lately?" he can only respond, "I lost a big one." For a long time, he was Superman, or at least everyone told him he was. Now, if he wants to feel good about himself, he'll have to find a way to define himself by something other than his ring record. That's okay, because he'd have to do that sooner or later anyway. I just hope Mike hasn't been too twisted out of shape by his earlier years of unblemished success. Mike does have some unusual habits and attitudes, especially when it comes to money. He is totally uninterested in it. There were times when I'd talk to him about financial planning, tax shelters, and investments, and I'd see, by the look in his eyes, that I'd lost him completely. It wasn't just that he couldn't follow what I was saying, he just doesn't have the slightest interest in the subject. Soon after the Spinks fight, I presented Mike with a check for $10 million. He said thank you, folded it, and put it in his jacket pocket without glancing at it. It was no big deal. A few days later, one of my accountants called me and said that the check had never been cashed and that we better find out what's going on. It turned out that Mike had simply misplaced the $10 million. When somebody reminded him about it, he shrugged and looked for the check. But it was a few weeks before it was found and deposited by one of his people. Because of the way Mike treats money, a lot of people have predicted that he'll be taken advantage of and left penniless, like so many heavyweight champions before him. Until I got to know Mike better, I used to say that myself. Now I believe that won't happen because of his street smarts. Mike will always know who's trying to take advantage of him and who's on his side, and I pity the guy who tries to rip him off. Yes, he gave a Bentley to a meter maid and a Rolls Royce to a couple of policemen without thinking twice. And when those stories got retold in the papers, he seemed to be out of control. But the truth is that those two cars constituted a tiny fraction of Mike's net worth. Giving them away was about the same as an average working person's parting with a pair of roller skates. In any case, those incidents date back to a time in Mike's life when he was extremely confused. I'm talking, of course, about his brief but troubled marriage to actress Robin Givens. The particulars of that period have been hashed over so many times in the press that by now everyone is familiar with the public story. Suffice to say that Mike, who is normally a picture of mental toughness, came completely apart at the press during this marriage. One night, at a point when things were happening fast and furiously, Mike called me at home. I told him to try to get a grip on himself. "Listen, Mike," I said, "you gotta ask yourself how you really feel about this woman." "Mr. Trump," he replied, sounding as confused as ever. "I just love that fucking bitch." I don't believe, though, that there were heroes and villains in this story. Despite the way they were portrayed in the news media, his wife Robin and her mother Ruth Roper were not evil women. In fact, they indirectly made a lot of money for Mike by insisting, as a matter of principle, that he get a better cut in his management contract with Bill Caton. At the same time, though, there was something about Robin that drove Mike crazy. She's an extremely beautiful woman, and Mike was fascinated and, in a way, intoxicated by that. I was very close to them during those difficult months, and they both turned to me at different times to express their feelings. I don't think I'm violating a confidence if I say that Mike's problem was that he was much more in love with the outer Robin than the inner one. But what happens most now to both of them and Robin is that the marriage is over and the turmoil has subsided. The one pitfall Mike must avoid in the future is the common mistake of thinking that success in one area means you're an all-around genius. Unless he undergoes a major personality change, Mike will never be a good businessman. For a while, I had planned to be Mike's financial advisor, something I would do for Mike, purely out of friendship, and probably for no one else. I soon realized, however, that this could never really happen because of Mike's total lack of interest in money. There would be no use in talking about my personal finances if no one was listening. My message to Mike for a long time now has been simple. Stay out of investments, real estate deals, and tax shelters. Just put some of your money into treasury bills and the rest into a solid bank. I've told him, though there are fewer and fewer of those around. Why should Mike try to earn more than 8% on his money when his income is $50 million to $100 million a year, and he needs very little on which to live? Any discussion of Mike's affairs eventually leads to the subject of Don King. Don, like Mike, is something of an enigma. The difference between the two is that Don delights in being one. He likes keeping people a bit off balance all the time because it usually works to his advantage. Don is always on stage with his wild hairdo and penchant for a long, rambling speech with big words. This act of his has led a lot of people to ask me what Don King is really like behind the closed doors at the end of a long, hard negotiation session. To that, I can only say, believe it or not, he's exactly the same. That bombastic personality comes naturally to him. And because he knows that he can wear people down and frustrate them with it, he's not about to change. Don's dealings with Mike proceeded in the classic manner of fighter-promoter relationships. When I first heard about the future heavyweight champ, he was a young kid being managed by Bill Caton and Jim Jacobs, partners in an advertising agency as well as a company that owned the world's largest collection of fight films. Don King was in the picture, but playing a minor role as Mike's promoter. When Jacobs died, Don King immediately moved in and tried to convince Mike that the fighter was making a mistake by staying with Caton. I know Bill, and I believe he is a true gentleman who always had Mike's interest at heart. But I also realize he is an older man whose background is very different from Mike's. He could never relate to Mike the way that Don King can. When King moved in on the young fighter, it really wasn't much of a contest. Though he comes off as clownish at times, Don is tough and very serious about his goals. It doesn't matter to him in the slightest that he's hated by many people, or that he has a reputation among the general public as a con man extraordinaire. The fact is he's not. He's a shrewd and hardened businessman. When a big fight is being discussed, he knows how to play me against my rivals in Las Vegas, and how to play all the Las Vegas interests against one another. He also has a fascination about beating the white establishment at its own game, and though that doesn't work in my interest financially, I happen to think it's admirable. As long as he plays fair and keeps his word, which he does with me, I can't complain that he plays the angles and drives a hard bargain. Don can be just as tough as hard with his fighters as he is with the people who are negotiating for his events. Don is not a maker of champions. He takes fighters who have reached the top away from the other managers and promoters. Even fighters as experienced and street smart as Roberto Duran and Larry Holmes have been convinced by Don. Through a combination of salesmanship and sheer tenacity, to forget their former connections and cast their lot with him. Often he does take them to new heights. But if a fighter tries to cross Don or to violate his contract, he's going to realize he's not dealing with a guy who's just a clown. Buster Douglas and his manager, Jimmy Johnson, found that out the hard way when they tried to get out of a binding deal they signed with King Enterprises. Don clearly has a right to promote a Tyson-Douglas rematch, and he's not going to walk away from what promises to be one of the great heavyweight clashes of the century. How will Don King treat Mike Tyson in the long run? Bill Caton had an interesting response to that question. Mike is suffering from the Patty Hearst syndrome, he told a reporter. He's fallen in love with his captor. Only time will tell how the King-Tyson relationship works out. But right now, I'm not worried about Mike. One reason is that Don has a tremendous affection for the still very young fighter. His desire to protect Mike at all costs is an almost obsession. I've never seen Don anywhere near as devoted to anyone else. The other reason I believe Mike won't get hurt is because Mike is no fool. This is a man who learned at a very young age to take care of himself. Shortly after he had that famous early morning altercation with a former opponent named Mitch Blood Green in a Harlem clothing store, I spoke to Mike on the phone and asked him if it had really been necessary to resort to physical violence. Mike sounded incredulous. "Mr. Trump," he said, "the guy was coming at me, trying to hurt me. I had to take him out." Mike may not give a damn about fluctuations in the gold market or pork belly futures, but he knows when someone's trying to hurt him. As long as he doesn't do anything to hurt himself, he's gonna be all right. Chapter 12, on toughness. I have a reputation for being tough, and I like to think it's justified. You must be tough when a lot of influential people are saying that your day is come and gone, and when your marriage is breaking up, and when business pressures are increasing. Toughness, in the long run, is a major secret of my survival, but I also realize that a lot of people who throw around the term have no idea what it really means. When I try to define toughness, I often conjure up a mental image of the great football running backs of years past. Those were not gentlemen, and yet no one ever accused them of being unfair. Sometimes you saw them just plowing ahead, sometimes sidestepping, sometimes spinning off blockers, and sometimes straight-arming opponents. Like all the great athletes and all the great business people, they knew the textbook plays, but they weren't afraid of going out and making up moves as they went along. They never used the same tactic twice. And yet one thing never changed. They were always moving forward, and with great determination, towards the goal at which they, as much as anyone else, were aiming. Toughness, as I see it, is a quality made up of equal pairs of strength, intelligence, and self-respect. I think I became intrigued with the quality as I grew up and watched what was happening to my older brother Fred, a great and talented guy who had a career as an airplane pilot, but who died of alcoholism a few years ago. Fred, though I loved him dearly, was not traditionally tough. He was sweet and trusting, and as a result, people consistently took advantage of him. Watching what happened to Fred, I learned to study people closely, and always to keep my guard up, in both my personal and my professional life. Fred was truly one of my great teachers. Occasionally, yes, toughness does involve some old-fashioned ass-kicking. There are times, for example, when on the spur of the moment, I'll dial the number of one of my hotels or the Trump shuttle just to see how long it takes my people to answer the phone. If I have to wait for more than 5 or 6 rings, I'll tell the employee who finally does answer who I am. Then I'll ask, without hiding my annoyance, what the problem is. I've found that usually the person will not have to be reminded about the standards I expect. Yet despite what many people think, being tough has nothing to do with bullying people. A bully to me is someone who is trying to work out some psychological problem by intimidating others. The real estate business, especially in New York, is full of bullies. People who've gotten somewhere in the past by screaming, and so they keep on screaming at their adversaries, their employees, their spouses. Someone like Lena Helmsley is a bully who is driven mostly by a desire to intimidate others or to get away with something that other people can't. Being a good businesswoman is, to her, secondary to being a bitch on wheels. Usually, I'm friendly, polite, and upbeat in my dealings with employees and even my business adversaries. I don't recommend speaking sternly to people or throwing your weight around unless it serves some clear purpose. If, in the course of conducting one of my spot checks, I find the Trump shuttle phone system less than perfect and express my displeasure or even my anger, I'm just taking care of business in an honest fashion. I'm not going behind anyone's back to complain or have someone fired. We've had a minute of unpleasantness, perhaps, but the air is cleared and we can all get back to business. I admire toughness in people such as Rupert Murdoch, Steve Ross, Ace Greenberg, Ron Perlman, Marty Davis of Paramount, Jack Welch of GE, and others. Those are men who expect to succeed and understand the ins and outs of maintaining success, but they don't feel out of their element when things aren't going well. They are capable of taking a long proposition and turning it around. I especially admire toughness in the people I'm negotiating with. Take a certain killer deal maker with the unlikely name of Sister Cecilia. I met Sister Cecilia a few years ago. Our paths crossed because she was in charge of the New York Foundling Hospital, a venerable Manhattan institution that stood for nearly 100 years on the corner of 69th Street and 3rd Avenue. That site was interesting to me because the Upper West Side had become, in the last 10 years or so, an extremely exciting and desirable area, especially for single and affluent people who could take full advantage of the Manhattan lifestyle. But I wouldn't have thought of approaching Sister Cecilia about her real estate if I hadn't also observed that having her hospital in such a fashionable neighborhood sitting on such valuable real estate made less sense every day. After all, this was an institution that was trying to provide health care to the city's poor. The idea I planned to discuss with Sister Cecilia was, I thought, good for both of us. I wanted to give her a great piece, a great price for her site, and then help her implement a plan by which the New York Foundling Hospital would be reorganized in the form of many smaller healthcare facilities that would be situated in poorer areas, downtown, Harlem, Brooklyn, and the South Bronx. And they were all desperately needed. The fact that there was a great piece of real estate for me, and the deal didn't make me any less proud of the idea, which I felt would help people and help stabilize some troubled neighborhoods. I called Sister Cecilia's office and asked for an appointment. She agreed, but without the slightest trace of enthusiasm. I should have known right then that I was dealing with a tough customer. Walking into her office was an experience I'll never forget. As I smiled and introduced myself, she looked at me sternly. I half expected, as I extended my hand in greeting, that she would rap me across the knuckles with a ruler. Instead, though, she just said, "What is it that you want?" Her eyes were piercing. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly. Everything about her said, "Cut the preliminaries, buddy boy, and get to the point." There was no warm-up time with this lady. Suddenly, I was center stage with the lights on, and I had to do my number. But that was okay with me. I had thought long and hard about what I was going to say, and I believed very strongly in my plan. "Sister," I said, I want to run an idea by you. This neighborhood has changed. Virtually all of your patients have to travel a considerable distance to get to the hospital, and they have nowhere to go for help in their own areas. On top of that, you need money to continue what you do. From there, I went to explain my plan in detail. I knew that just about every other developer in New York City was salivating over her site, and no doubt had approached her already, dangling big sums before her. I thought I had the advantage of them for several reasons. I had an idea for what the hospital might do with the money I was offering. I had a plan to put up a beautiful building in place of the outdated hospital structure, and I had an excellent track record for getting things done. I don't think I've ever pitched something more skillfully. I gave a 10-minute presentation into which I packed all the salesmanship, charm, and deal-making ability I could muster. Then I turned to her and said, "So, sister, what do you think?" And she just said, "No." Not, "You'll have to come up with a better offer," or "This is happening so fast, I'll have to think about it and get back to you." Just no. Then she turned around back to her work, making it clear I was dismissed. This, I knew, was one tough lady. Fortunately for me, I happen to be a very persistent guy. In analyzing the situation, I realized that there was nothing wrong with my plan or the offer I'd made. The problem, I concluded, was that as far as she was concerned, I was just some guy walking in off the street and making big promises. What I needed was someone to put me in the right context, so my reputation could work for me. In other words, a proper introduction. I let some time pass because I didn't want to come off as a nuisance to the Foundling Hospital people, and because I was busy with a lot of other things. But while I was waiting, the New York Archdiocese announced that it was selling the site and that it had hired a consulting firm to help market the property. The first thing I did when I heard the news was to call a good friend of mine, Bill Fugazi. Bill Fugazi founded one of New York's most fabulous limousine companies, and he's a great guy to play golf with. But the reason I called him that day is that he has a sister who's also a Catholic nun. Her name is Sister Irene, and because she runs the ITV, which is the Catholic TV network in New York, she's got connections with everyone in the church. "Bill," I said to my friend, "I'd like your sister to give Sister Cecilia a call on my behalf. I'm very interested in the Foundling Hospital property." "Bill," I said to a friend, So is every other real estate guy in New York, Bill said, "but the Archdiocese has a rule. They printed an elaborate brochure about the hotel property, and they're not taking any bids until the brochure goes out in the mail." "Just give me your sister's number," I said to him. "I'll take it from there." I was perfectly honest with Sister Irene. "I want to buy the hospital site," I said. But the first time I talked to Sister Cecilia, she killed me. She practically threw me out. I hadn't been treated like that since I got out of college. Now, my son, calm down," Sister Irene said. "Sister Cecilia is a saintly woman. She's just looking out for the hospital's best interest. I'll give her a call on your behalf and see what I can do." A short time later, she called back and said that Sister Cecilia would be happy to meet me to discuss the hospital site. I couldn't believe the change in attitude, but I wasn't taking anything for granted either. As added insurance, when I went to meet with her, I called another friend, Bill Flynn, the head of Mutual Insurance Company of America. In addition to being a staunch Irish Catholic, Bill was also the chairman of the Foundling Hospital Board. Don't let anyone ever tell you that having the proper connections isn't important. The difference between my first and my second meetings with Sister Cecilia was like night and day. I made my presentation all over again, and I ended up making a deal with her and Bill Flynn quickly and effectively. Meanwhile, the week after my visit, that brochure went into the mail, and the other developers began ringing Sister Cecilia's phone off the hook. A lot of them, I understand, were pretty angry when they found out that Donald Trump had already signed a deal for the site. The opposite of toughness, weakness, makes me mad and sometimes turns my stomach. I'm not referring here to the kind of weakness that comes from being poor, sick, or disadvantaged. I'm talking about those people who can take a strong stand, but just don't. That's why I started to speak out about what is happening to America, particularly on the business front. These days, with communism in retreat almost everywhere, it's tempting to think that the game is over and America has won. I don't see it that way. Our problems just don't get solved just because the Eastern Bloc system suddenly falls apart. That's victory by default. If we give ourselves credit for triumphing and fail to address the challenges that are before us on the international business and economic scene, America's role as the leading nation in the free world will be in serious jeopardy in the next 10 or 15 years. The United States has a great system of government and beautiful philosophy to go with it. Our problem is that we've stood behind our ideals only sporadically in recent years. President Reagan's mass firing of the air traffic controllers in 1981 comes to mind as an example of standing firm for a principle, as does our invasion of Grenada in 1983, and even more important, President Bush's military action that brought Manuel Noriega from Panama to an American jail in December 1989. To me, however, our bombing of Muammar Gaddafi's headquarters in Libya stands as a classic scene of how effective a tough stance is for a valid purpose can be in the area of international politics. Think about it. Gaddafi, for years, one of the great villains of the modern world, has hardly been heard from since those shells started exploding. But the record proves you don't always have to resort to missiles and rifles to get your point across. In fact, as the 20th century comes to a close, the greatest challenges and threats we face are economic ones. And they are coming from two of our supposed allies, Japan and Germany. I do a great business with both of those countries. The Japanese are a regular customer of mine for my real estate and frequent visitors to my casinos. The Japanese and the Germans hold out some of my loans. I know they will understand that by speaking out, what I'm really advocating is that we compensate Zell, that in our competitive Zell will be more like them, people and nations for whom I have a lot of respect. The Japanese and the Germans are not the kind of adversaries whom you face with weapons. Yet a wartime mentality may be just what we need to adopt when dealing with them. We have to think in terms of victory. The objective is not to vanquish those countries as we did in World War II. It is to bolster ourselves. Before we can prevail, we need to believe that those countries are not destined to always get their way. A big part of our problem is that we expect the Japanese to get the better of us. This gives them a tremendous psychological advantage. We think that they're always destined to be the winner, but that's not the way it has to be. Not long ago, I read a story in the papers saying that the Japanese were using an unusually large net in their fishing commercial operations. These nets, in the opinion of the other countries fishing in the same international waters, not only gave the Japanese an unfair advantage, but they also had a harmful effect on the environment because they led to the overharvesting of certain fish. Faced with that situation, The other countries might have just said, well, the Japanese, they're on top now, they're strong, they do what they want, but instead those countries got together, filed a strong protest with the proper authorities, and complained loudly to the press. In no time at all, the Japanese backed down and said they used the regulation nets again and observed the same rules and customs as everyone else did. The point is that sometimes what you have to do is ask, and if you display enough determination, what you want will eventually be given to you. You also have to be persistent. If asking once more doesn't work, my suggestion is just to ask again, perhaps a little more emphatically, and again, and again, and again. In my first book, I told the story of how I got a 40-year tax abatement from New York City when converting the old Commodore Hotel on 42nd Street into the Grand Hyatt. How did you ever get 40 years, people ask me? Because, I answered with a shrug, I didn't ask for 50. Too many politicians today don't understand that unless they stand up and say clearly what they want in a particular situation, they can't expect to get it. Or, more likely, they do understand that. But by nature, they are weak or worried about offending some special interest, and they will shrink from any kind of confrontation. As a result, they deal exclusively with companies in compromises and limp concessions. And that's why in the eyes of the rest of the world, even some of our supposed allies, when it comes to business, we've become a nation whose big dumb heart can be constantly taken advantage of. The Japanese don't miss a tick when dealing with us. They have important quotas and tariffs to protect their own interests. And they even have ways of sealing up the cracks left by their official policies to make sure almost no American goods get into their country. I know a man in the automobile business who told me that he had exported some cars to Japan, not with much hope of actually selling them there, but more as an experiment, just to see what would happen. With a shipload of American cars arrived at the dock, he found that the Japanese would need to thoroughly inspect his vehicles for their potential impact in the environment. How thorough are the Japanese in this regard? Well, they don't just check one car and figure out all the others made on the same assembly line must be virtually identical. Instead, they look at each car, taking the engine apart, putting it back together, and running various tests. My acquaintance in the auto business estimated that at the rate they are proposed to go, the Japanese inspectors would get through perhaps one car a day. That meant that his ship would be sitting in the harbor for 6 or 7 months before they had tested all of his cars and authorized them to be brought into the country. Under those circumstances, he had no choice but to order the ship to return to America, still fully loaded. Now, isn't it amazing that the most effective country in the world can't figure out a way to unload a ship in less than half a year? But of course, that's only part of the story. While the Japanese keep us from selling American-made cars to their country, Americans are buying tens of thousands of Toyotas, Nissans, and Hondas. One day not long ago, I read 2 interesting reports in the same newspaper. One said that the U.S. automakers were suffering through extremely tough times. The other noted that the Toyota Motor Corporation had nearly $12 billion in cash in its corporate war chest, and that one of its biggest problems at the moment was finding something to do with all that money. Think about it. The 10 largest banks in the world are all Japanese, and the largest bank in America, Citibank, ranks about 27th on the list. The trade imbalance with Japan is costing us, by my estimate, about $100 billion a year. Some may dispute that number, which is somewhat higher than the official figure, but no one denies that the situation is totally out of control. Yet what do we do in response? Well, we meet with Japan's representative and come away with promises of increased trade opportunities, but very few specifics and no timetable. Then, as if that weren't bad enough, when the Prime Minister gets back to Japan, the leading politicians tell him that he promised President Bush things that he had no right to promise, and that, essentially, the deal, which really wasn't that much of a deal, is off. Meanwhile, the United States is losing millions of dollars a day, and no one is doing anything about it. What really shocks me, though, is when I hear a man like Roger Smith, the head of General Motors, knocking his own product and praising the Japanese. Oh yes, the Japanese make a truly great car, Smith said on a nationally broadcast television show I happened to be watching not long ago. Then he added that GM wasn't up to that standard yet, but he fully intended to be, someday. I know Roger Smith could never have risen to the top of such a huge corporation if he were really as weak as he sounded. I know Roger Smith could never have risen to the top of such a huge corporation if he were really as weak as he sounded on that show. But the time has come to stop being diplomatic and always playing Mr. Nice Guy towards our trade rivals. Smith must realize that when an adversary can see fear in your eyes or hear it in your voice, you're as good as gone. A person may be able to survive in politics or a State Department job with no discernible talent. But in business, whether you're a man or a woman, you have to have a quality for which there is, unfortunately, no better term than balls. It's one thing to admire Japan for how far it has come in the decades since it was defeated in World War II. But many Americans are absolutely in awe of the Japanese. They feel that these people are somewhat destined to take over the world economically, and that there is no way they can be stopped. This attitude reminds me of how people used to talk about the Russians. They were wrong then, and I think they're wrong about the Japanese now. Not long ago, I got a call from an old friend whose voice, from the first hello, had that I need a big favor tone. Normally, I wouldn't have minded helping this particular caller with almost anything. I have a real soft spot for this guy. He's a stockbroker who always works hard and means well, even though many people, including his own wife, see him as one of life's perennial losers. But this time, the favor he wanted was pretty big. "Donald," he said, "you gotta help me. I'd like you to have a meeting with a man who's probably the second or third wealthiest man in Japan." "Why?" I asked. "Because he said he wanted to see you." Then I told him I might be able to arrange it. "Oh, you did?" I said. "What does he want?" "Just to ask you a few questions." "Listen, I'm very busy," I said. But he persisted. "Donald, you don't understand. This is very important. To me, for business reasons. I can't." "But please!" And as the conversation went on, he got more and more emphatic, until I finally agreed to meet the man from Japan in my office later that week. Incidentally, there's a lesson here. In business, as in life, there is more than one way to get what you want. As soon as I hung up the phone, it struck me that my friend's loser image may be something he cultivates and uses as a negotiating tool. If so, I guess it worked this time. But appearing to be weak is not a tactic that I'd recommend to anyone who is interested in success over the long haul. I put all my thoughts of the wealthy Japanese businessman out of my mind until a few days later, when, deeply absorbed in some work at my desk, I suddenly heard a commotion in my outer office. It sounded as if the New York Mets were paying me a surprise visit. The first thing I saw when I looked up was a guy slowly backing into my office with a video camera on his shoulder. The camera was pointed at the door. The photographer was followed by a man who was holding a still camera and clicking away madly. The second guy seemed to be taking pictures of everything in sight, including the first guy. What the hell is going on here? I wondered. It was incredible. No one had knocked or waited to be announced. They just barged in. I couldn't get too mad at these two photographers. They were just doing their job, which was apparently to record the entrance into my office of one of the wealthiest men in Japan. It was a good thing they'd brought a lot of film. The main guy didn't walk in right away. He was preceded by probably 11 or 12 underlings, each one looking like a high-powered businessman in his own right. But no, when their very intense-looking boss finally did enter, all the men in the entourage acted like butlers and bodyguards, taking the wealthy man's coat, sliding a chair under him, and so forth. As I sat there watching this spectacle, I thought that the people who believe I get pampered should see this. There were more surprises to come. My wealthy Japanese visitor Didn't even say good morning to me, he just started speaking. I want real estate, he stated. What? I asked. I want real estate for investment purpose. Hearing this, I shot a glance at my friend the broker, who had slipped into my office with this man's entourage. He looked back uneasily, as if to say, this is going to be a rough meeting, isn't it, Donald? I wanted to say, no, not really, but it sure as hell is going to be a short one. I then turned to my visitor, smiled, and said, this relationship between your country and mine has changed greatly in our lifetimes, hasn't it? His answer came quickly and matter-of-factly. Oh yes, Japan used to be down here, the man said, gesturing towards the floor, and America was up here. Now Japan is up here, and America is way down there. We no longer admire your country the way we used to, but I came to talk about real estate for investment purpose. At that point I stood up and told my very surprised visitor that I felt it was time for him and his people to leave. I hadn't thrown anyone out of my office in quite a while, but it felt good. I didn't have any qualms about showing them all to the door, because the wealthy Japanese gentleman was, to say the least, extremely rude. I only wish that I could say he was wrong too. Americans simply don't get the respect and deference we deserve as a great power, the undisputed leader in both military and economic strength. I thought it was brilliant when Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, countries in which many people live in mansions, stood by and allowed us to police the Persian Gulf for them, free of charge. In South Korea, there are often incidents in which our troops are abused and assaulted on the streets, even as Americans are buying huge quantities of Korean-made VCRs, computers, and TVs. The Germans have treated us even worse, if that's possible. For 2 generations, American troops have provided security for West Germany against the Soviets, but if an American tried to sell a pencil on the street in Germany, the authorities would practically throw them in jail. Meanwhile, those same Germans are sending their Mercedeses here as fast as they can make them, and the situation is getting more serious. By 1992, the Europeans will have formed an economic union that will make doing business in that part of the world even more difficult for us than it is now. At the same time, East and West Germany are embarked on reunification, which looms as very bad news for the rest of the world. Just look at the reaction of Germany's neighbors. From the moment the Berlin Wall crumbled, Britain and France have been deeply concerned about the ramifications of a single German nation. The United States should be worried as well, given Germany's 20th century history of trouble, not to mention a lack of fairness towards America in recent years. But predictably, we, still the most important and potentially most influential nation in the world, but fading fast, are once again sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing except waiting to be taken advantage of. The ironic thing is, there is no shortage of people out there who understand the need for business toughness. In the era since the Vietnam War, we have witnessed the rise of a generation of driven, intense, and sometimes ruthless individuals who come out of college and totally rewrote the rules of doing business in this country. Yet in our dealings with the rest of the world, we've too often become a bunch of suckers. And that's why I'm now making a modest proposal. I think America should call on its corporate leaders, independent deal makers, and other non-political public figures who emerged during the past 2 decades to help us forge a new relationship with the rest of the world. I'm suggesting that these people form a kind of all-star panel that would oversee America's negotiation with Japan, Europe, and other areas needing special attention. The Blue Ribbon Volunteers would be vested with as much authority as our Constitution would permit. Listed below are some people I'd choose for the job. I have watched them work, and in some cases, I've negotiated with them one-on-one. I can assure you that, if given a free rein, they could reverse America's eroding economic status and enhance our country's stature as a role model for the rest of the world in a matter of months. Jack Welch of General Electric, Harry Kravis of Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, the country's leading practitioner of leverage buyouts, Steve Ross of Time Warner, Martin Davis, chairman of Paramount Communications, Bob or Sid Bass, investors extraordinaires, Michael Eisner, CEO of Disney, Ron Perlman, another LBO wizard who owns Revlon, Ted Turner, the broadcaster, Carl Icahn, the boss of TWA. If I were selected to serve on this council, I know the first thing I'd propose, the imposition of a 20% tax on imports from Japan, Germany, and other countries that don't play by the rules. That money, which would amount to billions of dollars, could reduce the federal deficit and pay for education, housing, and medical care in poor areas throughout America. So what if the Japanese slapped a tax on us in response? The fact is, the effect would be negotiable because we buy a whole lot more from the Japanese than we sell them. Even as I write this, I can hear the howls of protest from the foreign businessmen who'd be affected, and can see them pounding on the doors of senators and congressmen demanding to be heard, but I wouldn't feel pressured by those tactics, as the politicians involved would, no doubt. Rather, I would take that strong reaction as an indication that I'd done the right thing, and that I'd move on to the next case. America has been weak, not just in dealing with other nations, but in dealing with our own internal troubles, such as drug abuse and rampant crime. I find this especially frustrating because from the mail I receive and the people I talk to, security guards, executives, construction workers, I get a sense that virtually everyone in America is sick of the lack of progress in solving those problems. They want action. And yet, the prevailing wisdom among politicians seems to be that taking too tough a stand can be hazardous to a person's political career. That really came home to me about a year ago, when I got involved in the debate over capital punishment. What happened, as some people will recall, was that a woman who worked as an executive on Wall Street was brutally raped and beaten by a gang of young men while she jogged in Central Park. That terrible incident had almost everybody in the city talking about how crime was out of control and how law enforcement officials were handcuffed by a system that ensured only the criminals' rights and kept the police in constant fear of facing charges of brutality. To my astonishment, though, some newspaper columnists and others actually leapt to the defense of the gang members. To these misguided people, the muggers and rapists were the real victims because of such underlying causes as poverty, a lack of educational opportunity, and so forth. Without minimalizing the plight of many people in our inner cities, that's ridiculous. The people who assaulted that jogger and then laughed about it after the police had picked them up were, in my opinion, one step removed from animals. I thought that if the woman had died, they would have deserved to be executed for what they had done, and so I took a full-page ad in the New York Times to say so. As soon as the ad appeared, I got calls from 7 or 8 top politicians congratulating me for taking a stand and saying that they agreed with my position. Those were very prominent people, household names with much power and influence to get things changed. So, why don't you take a similar position publicly? I asked each of them. You hold a high public office. You have a vote in your legislative body. I'm sure you could do some good. But each one responded in virtually the same way. Oh, gee, I'd like to, Donald, but it's such a controversial issue. When you're in politics, it's touchy. You can't really come down hard on things like this anymore. Ed Koch, who was then still mayor of New York, had the typical politician's reaction to my ad. While expressing the obligatory outrage, he said that he had controlled anger towards the criminals who'd beaten the woman jogger within an inch of her life, and then he didn't believe in hate. He didn't believe in hate. I do believe in hate when it's appropriate, and I think this is one of those occasions. No one cares about Ed Koch's opinions anymore. I think it's much more telling that since that had appeared, I'd received well over 15,000 letters of support for my position on capital punishment. Whenever I've taken a stand like that in public, people ask me if I have any plans to run for elective office. The answer is no. I'm not a politician. I wouldn't want to get involved in the compromises, the glad handling, and all the other demanding things you have to when you get the votes. Most of the best people we've had in government lately have, I've noticed, been appointed to their posts. But I do think I could get elected. At one time, I would have said yes, but do I think I could get elected? At one time, I would have said yes, probably, but now, since my marital problems and business pressures have been dragged through the newspapers, I'm less sure. In any case, I'd have to face one big obstacle if I ever did make a serious run for public office. Americans have become so accustomed to professional politicians that when they are faced with a strong personality, a man or a woman of action, they are afraid, or at least very wary. The fact is, there is a certain logic in the professional politician's reluctance to take a strong stand. Toughness is scary. A brilliant man like General Douglas MacArthur would never be allowed to rise to power in the America of today. I can imagine MacArthur hearing about 1,000 points of light and assuming Bush was talking about laser weapons. When we fear leaders of great passion, though, what we often forget is that the other side fears them too. I remember reading that Hitler, as he rose to power during his early years, continually talked to the people around him about Winston Churchill. Keep an eye on that man, he kept saying. He's going to be one of our biggest problems. The English politicians criticized Churchill for calling Hitler a mad dog. It wasn't diplomatic. In fact, they said it was downright inflammatory. Yet Hitler, in his way, respected Churchill, whom he recognized as not just another government official, but rather an advocate for the English people. A man who would never stop pushing and pressuring until he got what he wanted. And Hitler was right about that, of course. When Hitler's people told him that Churchill was potentially dead, no longer a problem, Hitler stated that Churchill would reemerge. People like that never die. One of our biggest problems today is that we have too few advocates. What we have instead are too many weaklings and compromisers. I respect smart, tough people, the way others admire great athletes or entertainers, even when these people are unpopular or down on their luck. That's why when John Connally, the former governor of Texas, phoned my office about a year ago, I took the call immediately. I'd met John Connally and shaken his hand once or twice, but I didn't really know him. So I was a little surprised when, in the course of a very friendly conversation, he made a request. His wife, Nell, was going to be honored at a dinner. He said it was going to be a very big night in Houston, and he wanted to know if I'd serve as an honorary chairman of the event. As I've already said, I'm not crazy about travel or about serving as chairman of big charity affairs. I often send a contribution or on condition that I don't have to show up for the event, even if it's someplace in Manhattan. But Connally was a man who had fascinated me ever since he was wounded at the time of President Kennedy's assassination in 1963. Later, when he was indicted in the so-called milk scandal of the early 1970s, I noticed that he remained calm, stated serenely that he was innocent, and was eventually cleared of all charges. More recently, John had experienced some severe financial hardships. He'd lost much of his money when the oil business went bad, and he'd been forced to declare bankruptcy. I'll never forget watching a news show and seeing John and Nell sitting with pride and dignity in the front row of an auction hall while all the belongings from their home were sold to the highest bidders. I can't speak for Connally's skill or luck as a businessman, but talk about toughness. Here was a man who many people thought would be president, and a woman who could have been the first lady, suffering a terrible embarrassment but continuing to hold their heads high. I knew, just watching the strength of character they displayed on that occasion, that they would both make it back. And the dinner John was inviting me to proved that they already had. I accepted, and I'm very glad I did. The event was a huge success and a celebration of John Connally's endurance, a quality that is particularly attractive in the form of toughness. So in the end, what is toughness? As I see it, midway through my life. Toughness is pride, drive, commitment, and the courage to follow through on things you believe in, even when they are under attack. It is solving problems instead of letting them fester. It is being who you really are, even when society wants you to be somebody else. Toughness is walking away from things you want because for one reason or another, acquiring them doesn't make sense. Toughness is knowing how to be a gracious winner and rebounding quickly when you lose. For a nation, toughness means avoiding complacency, meeting and solving problems head on, and being willing to use power for goals you know are honorable. In business, toughness means playing by the rules, but also putting those rules to work for you. It is looking at an adversary across the desk and saying simply, no. Sometimes if you hang in there long enough, as the boxing trainers always say, keep punching till the bell. People take notice and give you a boost. An editorial in the June 8, 1990 edition of the New York Times said this: Trump has given non-admirers plenty of reasons for the malicious glee with which they hear of his problems. Good at his business, at every opportunity he tells the world how good. He feels compelled to paint his name Trump on every acquisition. He flaunts his possessions, the biggest yacht, the biggest house, the grandest helicopter, and not long ago pronounced his intention of building the tallest building in the world. His main motive was not greed, but triumph. Arrogance, for sure. And yet, in a world lacking individual heroes, even some of Donald's critics must confess to a sneaking respect for his insistence on being himself, however outrageous, and catch themselves hoping he'll find the strength and luck to escape. As I've said repeatedly in my first book and in this one, I believe in working hard. I believe in being smart and not cute. I don't respect cheaters. My admiration is reserved for those who have achieved greatness and then top themselves. I'm never satisfied, which is my way of saying that there is a great deal I still want to do and believe that I should do. Some people are always saying that I can't go on like this forever, and that it's the beginning of the end. I'd rather see myself as being at the end of the beginning. And that concludes Trump Surviving at the Top from 1990. I really enjoyed this book. I think The Art of the Comeback I liked a little bit more, but this is still a really interesting book. And I love hearing about this period in Trump's life. You know, the early 1990s were a crazy time for him with the bankruptcy and all the businesses he was running, and I really admire his strength through this time. So I'd probably give this book maybe a 4 out of 5 stars. It's really interesting. And I think the next book I'm going to do, it's either going to be The America We Deserve from 2000 or Think Like a Billionaire. So stay tuned for that.